Welcome back to History Otherwise, where we explore the paths not taken in history. Today, we're standing on the precipice of one of the most famous summers in human memory, the summer of 1588. Everyone knows the story, right? The massive Spanish Armada sails to conquer England, but they're defeated by the Protestant Wind, the storms that scattered the fleet and saved Queen Elizabeth's throne. It's that classic David versus Goliath tale.
It is indeed the story we all learn. It's the moment England supposedly becomes a global power. But today, we're going to unpack the source material to see what happens when the wind blows just a little differently. Because the reality is, the margin between that victory and total catastrophic defeat was terrifyingly thin.
It really is a game of inches, or in this case, knots of wind speed. So here's our roadmap for this deep dive. We're going to break this down into 3 specific acts. First, we'll look at the single point of failure, the weather, and the logistics. Second, we'll walk through the rapid and likely brutal military conquest of England. And finally, and this is where it gets really mind-bending, we'll look at the cascading global consequences. We're talking a world without the United States or the Industrial Revolution.
It's a heavy topic. We need to approach this with, a bit of intellectual curiosity, but also respect for the gravity of it. We're talking about the potential erasure of the modern world as we know it.
So let's start with the setup, the David versus Goliath myth. You have some data here from the fact sheet that suggests the English were not exactly the scrappy underdogs we picture.
That's right. That image is largely Elizabethan propaganda that just stuck. If you look at the actual naval manifests, the English fleet was substantial. We're talking about nearly 200 ships. And critically, many were race-built galleons.
Race-built, what does that mean?
They were lower, faster, and much more maneuverable than the Spanish towering hulks. You see, the Spanish ships were essentially floating castles designed to transport troops. The English ships were gun platforms.
So if they had better ships and plenty of them, where was the danger? Why is this such a close call?
Logistics, specifically ammunition. The English strategy relied on keeping their distance and firing cannons, which meant they burned through gunpowder at an unprecedented rate. By the time we get to the critical date, August 9th, 1588, the English were practically empty.
Empty.
They'd hammered the Spanish at the Battle of Gravelines, but they hadn't sunk them. They had just exhausted their own supplies doing it.
So the English fleet is effectively a tiger without teeth at this point.
Exactly. They are drifting in the North Sea, watching the Spanish, but they can't actually fight.
Okay, so picture the scene. It's August 9th. In our timeline, a gale blows up the Protestant Wind and pushes the Spanish north to their doom. But here is the pivot point. What happens in our alternate scenario?
In this narrative, the wind doesn't blow. The gale becomes a calm. And this changes everything. You have the English fleet unable to engage, and you have the Duke of Medina Sidonia, the Spanish commander. Now, history often paints him as incompetent. The sources suggest he was actually a very capable administrator who was just dealt a bad hand by the weather.
And in the calm, he gets to play that hand properly.
Precisely. He uses his pinnaces, small oared boats, to tow the massive galleons back into formation. Because the water is calm, they can reform that famous, impenetrable crescent. They screen the English Channel, and most importantly, he sends the signal to the Duke of Parma, who is waiting in Flanders with the invasion army. The message is simple. The sea lanes are open.
That name, the Duke of Parma, he's the one the English were really afraid of, isn't he?
Terrified. Alexander Farnese, the Duke of Parma, was arguably the greatest military mind of the age. He has an army waiting in Dunkirk on barges. Once he gets that signal, he crosses.
That is the nightmare scenario. The fleet is bypassed. So now we move to Act 2, the invasion. Parma launches what the narrative calls Operation Albion. And this is where that David versus Goliath myth falls apart in the other direction.
Right. If the sea war was close, the land war wasn't. We have to talk about the mismatch on the ground. The Spanish army, the Army of Flanders, was the finest military machine in the world. These were the Tercios.
I love that word, tercios. It sounds so solid. What makes a tercio different from just a regular group of soldiers?
Think of it as a self-contained tactical city. It's about 3,000 men. They operated in massive squares of pikemen guys holding 15 to 18-foot spears surrounded by sleeves of musketeers. These were professional veterans, disciplined, ruthless, and incredibly efficient.
And who was waiting to stop this machine on the beaches of Kent?
The trained bands, essentially local militias, farmers, shopkeepers. The muster rolls show that many were armed with bills, which are basically farm tools on long sticks and bows.
Bows? You mean like Robin Hood-style bow and arrow?
Yes. The longbow was a legendary weapon, sure, but in 1588, against professional musketeers and armored pikemen, It was obsolete. The sources describe the landing at Margate not really as a battle, but as a slaughter. Parma lands his troops, the local militias try to stand, and they are just swept aside.
That is a chilling image, the professional conquerors just marching through the countryside. Now, I want to talk about one of the most famous moments in English history, Queen Elizabeth at Tilbury. I have the heart and stomach of a king.
Ah,
In our timeline, that's a victory lap, right?
right. It's a great PR moment in our history. But in this timeline, the speech still happens, but the context is horrific. Parma isn't fleeing. He's marching on London. He's taken Rochester. He's crossing the Medway. When Elizabeth gives that speech, she isn't cheering on a victorious army. She is making a desperate plea to terrified men who know what's coming.
It recontextualizes the whole thing, from triumph to tragedy. And then comes the fall of London.
Yes, the narrative describes a final battle at Blackheath, just south of the Thames. The English lines, commanded by the Earl of Leicester, they try to hold. But the Tercios do what they do. They push a pike. They break the amateur lines. It's a rout. And then the city of London itself, to save it from being sapped, burned to the ground like Antwerp was. The aldermen surrender.
And the Queen.
Captured. The sources paint a picture of the royal court cornered in the Tower of London. Elizabeth I, Gloriana, becomes a prisoner in her own palace.
Wow, that's the end of the Tudor era right there. So we enter Act 3. What happens to England? Does Philip II of Spain just declare himself king?
Interestingly, no. The plan, according to Philip's letters, wasn't for him to rule directly. He didn't want to annex England. It's an island. It's hard to manage. He wanted to neutralize it. So he installs a puppet regime. He puts his daughter, the Infanta Isabella, and her husband, Archduke Albert, on the throne.
So England becomes a satellite state.
Exactly. A client state of the Habsburg Empire. England keeps its name, but loses its sovereignty. And the first order of business is the religious purge. Cardinal William Allen returns. The Inquisition establishes a formal presence in London to purify the realm.
This is what really gets me, the cultural silencing. We call this the Golden Age. Shakespeare, Marlowe, what happens to all that?
It's extinguished. You have to remember, the theaters, the Globe, the Rose were seen by hardline Catholics as dens of immorality. They are closed down immediately. Shakespeare's only 24 years old in 1588. He hasn't written Hamlet, Macbeth, King Lear. In this timeline, he likely just goes back to Stratford to be a Glover like his father.
So we lose the plays, but it's deeper than that, isn't it?
Oh, much deeper. We lose the language. With the Spanish puppet court, Spanish becomes the language of power, of law. English is demoted to the language of the peasantry. It stagnates. We probably lose 50% of the vocabulary we use today.
That is a profound loss. But surely the English don't just roll over. There must be resistance.
There is. The narrative describes the Northern Fury. Ironically, the north of England, which was the Catholic stronghold in our history, becomes the center of Protestant resistance because that's where the remnants of the government flee. They set up a council in York.
So you get a guerrilla war in the Pennines.
Yes. And the Spanish Tercios are great at pitched battles, but they're not used to fighting insurgents in the Yorkshire Dales. It becomes a bleeding ulcer for the occupation. But without international support, it's just a delaying action.
Speaking of support, what about the neighbors? Scotland. King James VI is right there.
This is a classic example of realpolitik. James has a choice. Fight the world's only superpower to save a neighbor he doesn't particularly like, or take a bribe. The Spanish offer him neutrality and a guarantee of his own borders. He likely takes the deal.
And Ireland.
The exact opposite. The Irish earls, who fought the English for decades, welcome the Spanish as liberators. Ireland becomes a strong, loyal, Catholic client state of the Habsburgs. It totally inverts the history of the British Isles.
Okay, let's zoom out. We've covered Britain, but the premise here is the global consequence. Why does the fall of England matter to someone living in the 21st century?
It matters because of the domino effect. In 1588, England was the keystone supporting the Dutch revolt. Without English money and ships, the Dutch resistance against Spain collapses. France, torn by its own civil wars, finds itself completely surrounded by Habsburg power. It becomes a satellite.
So the Spanish century doesn't end.
It never ends. We enter a period of Pax Hispanica, a Spanish peace. Europe becomes a monolithic Catholic bloc dominated by the Habsburg dynasty.
And what about the New World, the Americas?
This is perhaps the biggest divergence. Think about the English colonies. Jamestown, Plymouth, the Mayflower. None of that happens.
For Thanksgiving.
No Thanksgiving. No 13 colonies. The Atlantic is a Spanish lake. North America is settled slowly, from the south up. The Spanish move up from Mexico into what we call Texas, California, across the Mississippi.
But they settle it differently, right? It's not about religious freedom or town halls.
Exactly. The English model was about settlement moving families, building towns, creating local assemblies. The Spanish model was imperial. It was about extraction and conversion, missions and presidios, military outposts, not self-governance.
So the unclaimed empire, as the source calls it, becomes a vast extension of New Spain.
Which means no United States of America ever forms. The political entity that defined the 20th century simply never comes into existence. No Declaration of Independence, no Constitution, no We the People.
That is hard to wrap your head around. But it goes deeper than just politics, doesn't it? The stagnation of ideas.
This is the so what that really keeps historians up at night. The English trajectory, and by extension the American one, was chaotic. It was full of civil wars, arguments, competing factions, but that chaos bred innovation.
How so? Can you give us an example?
Look at the Royal Society, founded in London a few decades later. Their motto was nullius in verba, take nobody's word for it.
Oh.
That is the foundation of modern science. Question authority. Test everything. In a world dominated by the Inquisition, that motto is heresy.
Because you have to take the church's word for it.
Exactly. Stability comes at the cost of inquiry. The Enlightenment relied on the specific freedoms that developed in England and Holland. Crush those societies, you crush the Enlightenment.
And without the Enlightenment.
You likely don't get the Industrial Revolution. That required a very specific set of conditions. Patent laws, property rights, a merchant class with political power, things that existed in England but not in the Spanish Empire. The Spanish Empire was incredibly wealthy, but it wasn't innovative.
So paint a picture of the 20th century in this timeline. The year is 1950. What does the world look like?
It's a quieter world, a slower world, a world of ancient agrarian empires. There's no electricity lighting up cities at night, no steam trains. Medicine is likely still based on humors. It's a world that has been frozen in a kind of late medieval stasis.
Stable but stagnant.
Yes. No world wars, perhaps, because there are no rising industrial powers to fight them, but also no antibiotics, no moon landing, no internet. The chaotic trajectory of ideas that gave us our world was severed in 1588.
It really brings us back to that first point about fragility. We tend to think of progress as inevitable. Of course we discovered electricity.
But it wasn't. It was contingent. It depended on a specific nation surviving, developing a specific legal system, and then exporting that culture to a specific continent. If the wind blows differently on August 9th, 1588, that chain is broken.
Makes you look at a weather map with a lot more respect.
It certainly does. It reminds us that what we call history is often just a series of near misses.
So as we wrap up, I want to leave our listener with a thought. We've painted a picture of a world that is stable, unified, perhaps more peaceful. But the price tag was the silencing of Shakespeare, the loss of democracy, and the stalling of human invention.
It raises the ultimate question: what is the value of chaos? We often fear instability, but in this case, the chaos of the English winds and the chaos of English politics were the crucibles of the modern world.
A chaotic win for a chaotic future. Thank you for walking us through this. It's been a fascinating, if slightly terrifying journey.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
It's always good to remember how close we came to a very different present.
And to our listener, next time you hear the wind howling outside your window, just remember, it might be doing more than just rattling the panes. It might be shaping the future.
Thanks for listening. Because history might have turned otherwise.